If you think helping a stranger will go unnoticed, think again. Emily Carter muttered to herself as the storm-laden wind rattled the thin wooden shutters of her small border town clinic. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the muddy path outside where the silhouettes of twisted trees bowed under the weight of rain. Emily's hands, calloused from years of tending to the town's sick and wounded, moved with steady precision over the stranger's soaked coat as she cleaned and dressed the wounds that marred his shoulders and arms. She had no idea who he was, and no one had warned her about strangers wandering in a town at night, yet instinct overrode caution. The stranger's breathing was shallow, his features partially hidden beneath a hood drenched in water, but even in the dim candlelight, Emily noticed a quiet strength in his posture, a subtle tension that hinted at a presence beyond ordinary. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the distant murmur of townsfolk shuttering their windows, unaware of the silent struggle unfolding in Emily's clinic. She worked efficiently, each movement deliberate, the bandages snug but not constricting, her mind a mixture of concern and curiosity. There was something about the stranger that resonated with her, a faint vibration in the air that made her pulse quicken despite the rain-soaked chill. She adjusted the candle to better light the small wooden table, casting elongated shadows that danced across the walls, and in that flickering glow, she caught the briefest glimpse of silver in his eyes as they fluttered open. Emily held her breath, feeling the weight of responsibility press on her shoulders, yet a calm determination grounded her hands. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, her voice soft but unwavering, a promise she made not for recognition, but because it felt inherently right. The stranger's gaze met hers, a flicker of acknowledgement passing between them, subtle but undeniable, and Emily's heart thumped with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Beyond the door, the storm continued to rage, masking the sound of distant hoofbeats and the faint rumble of carts on muddy roads. Yet inside, the world narrowed to this small space, to her hands, and to the stranger who depended entirely on them. Each adjustment of the bandage, each careful application of antiseptic, carried with it a silent testament to her skill, her compassion, and her courage. She stepped back for a moment, surveying her work, noting the faint warmth returning to his cheeks despite the cold that clung to their surroundings. It was then, as the wind rattled the windows with renewed vigor, that Emily sensed it. A shift in the atmosphere, subtle but charged, as though the very air acknowledged the significance of this encounter. Somewhere in the storm-swept distance, she felt the unmistakable weight of eyes observing, of power approaching, yet she remained focused, her hands steady, her breath measured, and her resolve unshakable. In that brief, electric moment, she realized that what had started as an act of quiet mercy might soon ripple far beyond her tiny clinic, touching forces she had not yet imagined, and setting into motion events that would change everything she had ever known. The storm outside began to ease, leaving behind a scent of damp earth and pine that filled Emily Carter's small clinic with a quiet serenity. She adjusted the makeshift bed where the stranger lay, noting the subtle rise and fall of his chest as he slept, each breath steadying under her care. The candlelight flickered gently, casting soft shadows that played across the walls lined with jars of herbs and neatly stacked linens. Emily took a deep breath, her hands resting for a moment on the edge of the table, reflecting on the unremarkable night that had suddenly become extraordinary. Despite the exhaustion from tending to the town for years, a strange anticipation pulsed through her veins, a sense that something significant had begun, though she could not yet name it. Outside, the first signs of dawn touched the sky, faint pink and gold streaks against the receding gray of the storm clouds. The door rattled slightly as a gust of wind pushed through the cracked frame, and Emily rose to secure it, her movements careful not to disturb the stranger. She glanced at him again, noting the delicate curve of his brow, the faint lines that suggested both youth and experience, and a quiet dignity that seemed to radiate even in vulnerability. Her mind wandered to the choices that had brought her here, the long hours, the acts of small kindnesses, and how each had built toward moments like this, where compassion became more than routine, where it transformed into significance. The distant sound of footsteps on the muddy path made her pause, ears straining, but it was only a crow perched on the edge of the roof, its silhouette stark against the brightening sky. Emily exhaled slowly, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips, feeling a subtle connection to the world beyond the clinic walls, a reminder that she was part of a larger rhythm, one that sometimes made the smallest acts carry the greatest weight. She reached over and gently smoothed the blanket over the stranger, her touch careful, measured, reverent in the quiet stillness of early morning. As the sunlight began to filter through the thin curtains, catching in his hair and glinting off the dampness, she noticed a flicker of movement beneath the hood as his eyes opened just slightly, silver flecks catching the light, a hint of awareness and curiosity. Emily's pulse quickened, but her voice remained steady and calm as she whispered, "You are safe now." She observed him as he shifted minutely, his gaze seeming to seek something familiar, a recognition unspoken yet palpable. The world outside began to awaken, the soft hum of birds, the rustle of leaves in the gentle morning breeze. But inside the clinic, time felt suspended, held between the warmth of the candle and the cool touch of dawn. Emily felt a quiet confidence, a deep-rooted assurance that the choices she had made, the risks she had taken, were unfolding exactly as they should, carrying with them a promise of events that would extend far beyond this small, candlelit room. Every sound, every flicker of light, every measured breath of the stranger seemed to align, as if the universe itself acknowledged the importance of this brief intersection of lives, signaling the cusp of something larger, something waiting just beyond the horizon. The first full light of morning settled over the border town like a quiet unveiling, turning the muddy paths into soft amber reflections and the rooftops into gentle silhouettes against a pale sky. Inside the small clinic, Emily Carter moved with calm precision, preparing a fresh bowl of clean water while keeping her attention on the stranger who now seemed more present than before. His breathing had deepened into a steady rhythm, and though his eyes were still partially closed, there was a subtle awareness in the way his fingers shifted against the edge of the blanket. Emily noticed everything, the smallest movements, the faint tension in his jaw, the way his body seemed to respond to the world around him even in rest. She stepped closer, checking the bandages she had carefully placed the night before, satisfied that the wounds were healing properly. Yet there was something unusual about the speed of his recovery that she could not easily explain. The morning birds outside grew louder, filling the air with a natural rhythm that contrasted with the quiet stillness inside the room. And for a brief moment, Emily allowed herself to breathe more deeply, feeling a fragile sense of peace. That peace, however, was interrupted by a distant sound that did not belong to the morning routine of the town, a low, structured rhythm like coordinated movement on horseback traveling far beyond the main road. Emily paused, her hand still hovering above the water bowl, listening carefully as the sound faded and returned again, too organized to be coincidence, too deliberate to be random travel. She moved to the window and gently pulled the curtain aside just enough to see the horizon where the forest met the open fields, but there was nothing visible yet, only the shifting light of morning and the faint mist rising from the ground. Behind her, the stranger shifted slightly for the first time with more intention, his eyelids lifting further as though the distant sound had reached him in a way that words could not. Emily turned back immediately, noticing the change in his expression, the subtle sharpening of his awareness, as if something far away had pulled him back from sleep. "You are awake," she said, softly, maintaining her calm tone as she stepped closer, careful not to overwhelm him. His gaze slowly met hers, and in that moment she felt again that same strange sensation from the night before, a quiet pressure in the air, like standing at the edge of something vast and unseen. The stranger's voice, when it finally came, was low and slightly strained, as if unused for a long time, and he spoke only a single word at first, "Where?" Emily hesitated for only a second before answering, telling him the name of the town and the fact that he was safe within a small medical clinic on its outskirts. His eyes shifted slightly, as if processing more than just her words, absorbing details beyond what was spoken. Outside, the distant rhythmic sound grew faint again, leaving only silence and morning wind in its place, but the impression it left lingered heavily in the air. Emily returned to her work, adjusting the water bowl, and preparing simple supplies. Yet she could feel that nothing about this morning was ordinary anymore. The stranger finally attempted to sit up, his movement slow but controlled, and Emily instinctively stepped forward to steady him if needed, though he managed without falling. As he sat there, the morning light fully revealed his features, no longer hidden in shadow, and Emily noticed a quiet intensity in his expression, something measured and deeply aware. Neither of them spoke for a few seconds, but the silence between them was no longer peaceful. It was charged with the sense that something far beyond this room had already begun to shift, even if neither of them yet understood the direction it would take. Emily Carter stood near the window for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the quiet horizon where the morning mist slowly dissolved into pale gold light. The distant rhythmic sound she had heard earlier returned again, softer now but more defined, like coordinated movement traveling across open fields far beyond the town limits. It carried an unusual weight that made the air inside the clinic feel subtly different, as if the world outside had begun to align itself toward an unseen arrival. She turned back toward the stranger, who was now sitting upright on the edge of the small bed, his posture more stable than she would have expected after the injuries she had treated the night before. His eyes were fully open now, revealing a calm intensity that made it difficult to determine what he was thinking, yet there was no hostility in his expression, only a quiet awareness that seemed to take in every detail of the room. Emily approached slowly, carrying a clean cloth and a small cup of water, placing them within his reach without forcing assistance, respecting the subtle distance he seemed to maintain. "You should take your time," she said gently, her voice steady and reassuring, though inside she felt that same inexplicable sense of anticipation growing stronger, as if the space around them was holding its breath. The stranger accepted the water, his movements controlled and precise, and as he drank, Emily noticed something subtle in the way his hand steadied the cup, a strength that did not match someone who had been so heavily wounded only hours before. He set the cup down carefully and looked toward the window, his gaze lingering as though he could sense the same distant movement she had heard. "There is activity beyond this town," he said quietly, his voice now clearer, carrying a natural authority that did not feel forced. Emily nodded slightly, stepping closer to the window again, but keeping her attention on him as well, unsure why his presence seemed to shift the atmosphere in the room. "I heard it earlier," she admitted, "but I do not know what it is." For a brief moment, silence settled between them again, but it was no longer empty. It felt layered, as though unspoken understanding was forming in the space between their words. The stranger's expression tightened just slightly, not in fear but in recognition, as if the distant sound carried meaning only he could fully interpret. Emily noticed the change immediately, her instincts sharpening as she observed him more carefully, realizing that whatever she had brought into her clinic was far more significant than a simple traveler. Outside, the light grew brighter, casting longer shadows across the wooden floor, and the faint sound in the distance began to fade again, leaving behind an uneasy stillness that contrasted with the calm morning air. The stranger finally stood, testing his balance with quiet certainty, and Emily stepped back instinctively to give him space, though her eyes never left him. He looked down at his hands for a brief moment, then back toward her, and there was something unspoken in that exchange, a recognition of circumstances neither of them had yet named. Emily felt her pulse steady but alert, aware that the calm she had known in this clinic was no longer the same, and that whatever lay beyond the horizon was now connected to the moment unfolding inside these walls. The silence inside the clinic felt heavier as Emily Carter watched the stranger fully rise to his feet, his movement steady now, as though the injuries from the previous night had been nothing more than a passing shadow. She remained near the edge of the room, observing carefully, her instincts telling her that what she was witnessing did not align with anything she had ever seen in her years of healing others. The morning light had grown stronger, pouring through the narrow window and illuminating every detail of the small space, from the worn wooden table to the neatly arranged medical supplies she had collected over time. The stranger stood still for a moment, as if orienting himself not just to the room, but to something beyond it, his gaze briefly shifting toward the window again where the faint horizon line met the distant fields. Emily followed his gaze, noticing that the earlier sense of movement in the distance had grown even more subtle, almost as if whatever was approaching was intentionally staying hidden from ordinary sight. She turned her attention back to him when he finally spoke again, his voice quieter but more certain than before, carrying an undercurrent of urgency that he seemed not fully willing to explain. "This place is not secure," he said calmly, as though stating a fact rather than issuing a warning. Emily felt a flicker of unease, though she kept her expression steady, maintaining the composure she had learned from years of working in uncertain conditions. "It has been safe for as long as I have been here," she replied, though even as she said it, she realized how fragile that statement sounded in the face of his certainty. The stranger turned slightly toward her, and for the first time she noticed how his presence seemed to subtly change the atmosphere around him, as if the air itself adjusted to his attention. He did not argue, but instead stepped closer to the window, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the horizon with focused intent. Emily moved beside him, following his line of sight, and this time she caught something more distinct in the distance, faint silhouettes that moved in coordinated formation far beyond the fields, too organized to be ordinary travelers and too distant to clearly identify. Her heart rate increased slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that something beyond her understanding was unfolding just outside the boundaries of her quiet life. The stranger exhaled slowly, his expression tightening just enough to reveal recognition without explanation, and he spoke again in a lower tone. "They are searching." Emily looked at him, searching his face for clarity, but he offered none, only a controlled stillness that suggested he understood far more than he was willing to reveal. "Searching for what?" she asked carefully, though she already sensed that the answer would not be simple. For a brief moment, he did not respond, as if weighing how much truth could safely be spoken within these walls. And in that silence, Emily felt the world outside press closer, not physically but in presence, like a storm gathering beyond sight. When he finally answered, his voice remained calm, but the weight behind his words changed the air in the room. "For me." The simplicity of the statement carried an intensity that made Emily instinctively take a half step back, not out of fear, but out of the sudden awareness that the man she had brought into her clinic was not an ordinary traveler at all. The morning sunlight continued to brighten the room, yet it now felt different, as if it illuminated not safety, but the fragile boundary between calm and something far greater waiting just beyond the horizon. Emily Carter stood motionless. For a moment after the stranger's words settled into the air, the meaning of them pressing against the quiet walls of her small clinic like an unseen weight. The morning light had fully taken over the room now, yet it no longer felt warm or ordinary, instead carrying a sharp clarity that made every detail feel heightened and deliberate. Outside the window, the distant fields remained still, but the faint sense of coordinated movement Emily had noticed earlier now felt closer, as if the distance between her and whatever was approaching had subtly shortened without any visible change. She turned her attention back to the stranger, watching as he stepped away from the window and moved with careful control toward the center of the room, his posture steady but alert. There was no panic in his expression, only a composed awareness that suggested he had experienced moments like this before, moments where silence before impact carried more meaning than sound itself. Emily approached slowly, her voice calm but firm as she asked, "If they are searching for you, then why are you here and not continuing to move?" The stranger paused, his gaze briefly lowering as if considering not just her question but the consequences of answering it fully. When he finally spoke, his tone remained controlled, but there was a subtle shift in it, something that hinted at responsibility beyond personal safety. "Because I could not continue without being stabilized," he said simply, glancing toward the bandages she had placed the night before. Emily followed his gaze, realizing that her actions from the previous night had done more than she had initially understood. They had not just treated wounds, but potentially altered the course of whatever pursuit had been unfolding. The realization did not frighten her, but it grounded her more firmly in the present, as though the situation had shifted from abstract concern into tangible consequence. Outside, a faint vibration seemed to pass through the ground, subtle enough to be mistaken for wind or distant movement, yet distinct enough to make Emily instinctively place her hand against the window frame. The stranger noticed immediately, his eyes narrowing slightly as he moved closer to the window again, scanning the horizon with increased focus. "They are closer than before," he said quietly, not as speculation but as confirmation. Emily felt her breath steady rather than quicken, her mind shifting into the same practical rhythm she used when treating critical cases, assessing rather than reacting. "Then what should we do?" she asked, her voice measured and calm despite the growing uncertainty outside. The stranger turned toward her fully now, and for the first time his expression softened slightly, not in weakness but in acknowledgement. "You did not know what you were saving last night," he said, his tone carrying a quiet weight. "But your choice has already changed what comes next." Emily held his gaze, searching for clarity, but he offered no further explanation, only a brief pause before continuing. "There will be no return to what was before this moment," he added, stepping back from the window, as if accepting something already in motion. Emily absorbed his words without interrupting, her thoughts aligning with the growing sense that the calm existence she had known in this clinic was no longer intact. The morning sunlight continued to pour into the room, bright and steady, yet it now felt like illumination over a threshold rather than a safe beginning, marking the quiet edge of something irreversible already moving toward them. The atmosphere inside the clinic had shifted into a quiet stillness that felt heavier than silence itself, as Emily Carter stood near the center of the room, watching the stranger with careful attention. His presence no longer felt like that of an injured traveler, but rather something anchored, deliberate, and increasingly aware of the space around him. The morning light that poured through the window now seemed sharper, casting long, defined shadows across the wooden floorboards and making every small movement feel significant. Outside, the faint sense of distant coordination that had been building for hours was no longer subtle. It had become a steady presence at the edge of perception, like something large and organized moving just beyond sight. Emily's instincts told her that whatever was approaching had entered a phase where concealment was no longer absolute, even if it remained visually hidden from her view. The stranger turned slightly away from the window, his gaze lowering as though evaluating something beyond immediate surroundings. And when he spoke, his voice carried a controlled finality that made the room feel even smaller. "They have crossed the outer perimeter," he said calmly, as if confirming a known outcome rather than announcing a new development. Emily felt her focus sharpen instantly, her mind processing the implication without panic but with clear awareness that the situation had moved beyond passive uncertainty. She stepped closer, maintaining steady eye contact, and asked, "How far are they from here?" The stranger paused for a brief moment, as though calculating distance with precision only he could fully interpret, then responded, "Less than a few miles, but they are not moving carelessly." Emily absorbed this without interruption, her expression remaining composed even as the weight of the information settled into place. The room felt unchanged physically, yet emotionally it was no longer the same space she had known for years. It had become a point of convergence between stillness and approaching inevitability. The stranger moved a step closer to the window again, not to look out with urgency, but with recognition, as if confirming patterns that were already understood. Emily followed his movement, noticing how his posture remained steady despite the growing significance of what he had just revealed. "Why here?" she asked quietly, not expecting a simple answer, but needing to understand the reason her small clinic had become part of something so far beyond its normal reach. The stranger did not answer immediately, and during that silence Emily became aware of how the morning light continued to brighten the room, illuminating dust particles in the air like suspended time. When he finally spoke, his tone carried a depth that suggested understanding of consequences rather than explanation alone. "Because this is where I was stabilized and where my presence was last confirmed," he said, his gaze briefly shifting toward her before returning to the horizon. Emily felt a subtle tension form in her chest, not fear, but realization that her actions had created a connection between this place and something far larger than she had ever intended. She looked toward the window again, noticing how the distant horizon seemed unchanged to the eye, yet no longer felt empty in meaning. The stranger took a slow breath, then added, "And because they will not ignore that signal." Emily remained still, her mind aligning the pieces without needing them fully explained, understanding that the quiet life she had known within these walls had already been intersected by forces moving with purpose beyond her control. The morning light continued to spread through the room, steady and unwavering, but now it felt like illumination over the beginning of something that had already passed the point of return. The first shift in the air came without warning, subtle at first, like pressure changing before a storm breaks open over open land. Inside the clinic, Emily Carter felt it before she saw anything, a faint tightening in the atmosphere that made the wooden walls seem closer than before. The morning light, once steady and warm, now carried a sharper edge as if it had been filtered through something heavier approaching from the distance. The stranger stood near the window without moving, his posture unchanged, yet the stillness around him had transformed into something more deliberate, as if he had already accounted for what was coming. Emily stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the faint silhouettes had been earlier, but now the space beyond the fields felt different, no longer empty, but filled with an unseen presence pressing toward them. The stranger spoke before she could ask anything, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that settled into the room like gravity itself. "They have reached visual range," he said quietly. Emily's breath remained steady, though her awareness sharpened instantly, every instinct aligning with the realization that whatever was approaching was no longer distant or theoretical. Outside, the morning birds fell silent one by one, their absence more noticeable than any sound they had made earlier, leaving only the soft wind brushing through the grass beyond the clinic. Emily turned back toward the stranger, studying his expression carefully, searching for any sign of uncertainty, but there was none. Instead, there was recognition, as if this moment had been anticipated long before it arrived. "What will happen now?" she asked, her voice measured, not filled with fear, but with the need to understand. The stranger did not immediately answer, instead taking a slow step away from the window and into the center of the room, as though placing himself between Emily and the unseen force beyond the horizon. The action was subtle, almost unnoticed at first, but it carried meaning that even silence could not hide. When he finally spoke, his tone remained controlled, but there was a shift in it now, something closer to certainty. "Now they confirm what they already know," he said. Emily processed the words carefully, her mind connecting fragments of what had been revealed earlier, the pursuit, the stabilization, the signal, all converging into something she could no longer separate into simple explanations. The room felt smaller again, not physically but in perception, as if the boundaries of the clinic had become the boundary of a larger unfolding event. She glanced once more toward the window, and this time she saw it clearly, faint movement at the edge of the distant field, too organized to be natural motion, too synchronized to be coincidence. The stranger's gaze followed hers, and for the first time, a subtle tension appeared in his expression, not fear but acknowledgement of scale. Emily took a slow breath, steadying herself, and stepped closer to him rather than away, surprising even herself with the choice. "If they are this close," she said quietly, "then staying here is no longer just about safety." The stranger turned slightly toward her, his expression softening just enough to register understanding, and for a brief moment, there was something unspoken between them that did not require clarification. Outside, the horizon line seemed unchanged to the eye, yet everything within it felt charged, as though the world itself had paused at the edge of a decision it could no longer delay. The morning light continued to pour through the window, illuminating the room with a steady brightness that contrasted sharply with the growing sense that nothing about the day would remain ordinary for much longer. The distant motion outside became unmistakable, the soft rhythm of countless coordinated steps drawing nearer across the fields until the horizon itself seemed alive with purpose. Inside the clinic, Emily Carter remained near the stranger, now fully aware that what was approaching was not simply an ordinary party or patrol, but an organized force that carried authority and intent beyond anything she had imagined. The stranger, standing near the center of the room, his posture calm, yet commanding, watched the horizon with eyes that flickered with recognition and measured patience. Emily felt the tension settle in her chest, a quiet energy that was neither fear nor panic, but alertness sharpened to precision, knowing that the moment she had been inadvertently part of was reaching its inevitable convergence. The morning light poured in through the window, filling the room with brightness that highlighted the contours of her small clinic and the deliberate movements of the stranger, illuminating details that made everything feel immediate, charged, and vital. She noticed the way his gaze shifted subtly as the shapes at the horizon became more defined, organized, and purposeful, yet he did not speak, allowing the space between them to carry the weight of anticipation. Emily moved slightly closer, her instincts guiding her to stay within reach while maintaining respect for the presence and authority that radiated from him, a presence that she could sense even without words. The soft sound of the wind in the trees outside seemed to harmonize with the approaching force, carrying a rhythm that made the wooden floorboards beneath her feel alive with subtle vibration. The stranger finally turned toward her, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through the charged stillness of the room. "They are here, and they are observing everything, including us." Emily nodded slowly, her thoughts aligning with the clarity he offered, understanding that their small actions in this quiet clinic had sent ripples far beyond its walls, shaping events she had never intended to influence. As she glanced toward the window once more, the outlines of figures became faintly visible against the brightening morning, disciplined, deliberate, yet maintaining distance, conveying presence without intrusion. The stranger stepped slightly forward, placing a protective presence between Emily and the doorway. His expression softened as he acknowledged the unspoken connection that had grown between them over the past hours. Emily felt a quiet courage settle within her, a sense that her decision to act with compassion and care had not gone unnoticed and was now part of something larger, a recognition that stretched far beyond her understanding. The horizon held the approaching figures in suspended balance, a delicate harmony of anticipation and awareness, and the sunlight continued to illuminate the clinic, making every object, every gesture, every subtle movement between her and the stranger feel consequential. For a long moment, they both stood in quiet observation, acknowledging the shift in the world around them, aware that nothing would ever return to the ordinary calm of before, and that from this point onward, every choice, every breath, and every action carried the weight of what had begun, binding them together in a shared moment that marked the threshold of something vast, deliberate, and irrevocably significant.